everything, but there was a Washington Post editorial this week. Americans are burning record amounts of gasoline. The Energy Department announced August 31st that the country fueled up more this June than any other month the agency has measured, underscoring a finding last month that the United States is on track to set an annual gas consumption record in 2016. This was not supposed to happen. And then it goes on with fuel usage, and then it talks about global warming, and then it says, isn't this a time for a carbon tax? Now, I want to point out two things to you here. Number one, remember I predicted. I said when all the dust settles and the pachinko game ends and all of the marbles bounce out of the machine, it'll come down to a tax. After all the pious platitudes, it's down to a tax. Why? Because the theory is when you tax something, you get less of it. And the global elites, ever since the UNCED conference in 1992, have just been drooling over the potential of a global energy tax of sorts or a global financial tax, which they're working on very hard. But you have to understand the hypocrisy here, because quite frequently in our economic speak by the politicos, they tell us that we get richer when we're taxed. And it's better for us because they can stimulate the economy, ignoring the fact that when you tax businesses, you destroy more jobs than you create. So on one hand, they're telling us we need to tax something so we get less of it. And on the other hand, they're telling us we need to tax you because you'll get more of it. Which one is it? The free speech, you got to love it, right? Yeah, but the free speech, we get to tell them which is right and which is wrong. You tax something, you get lots less of it. We're at steelonsteel.com. I'm John Leffler. The program is Steel on Steel. I have been telling you for a long time here on the program, very much like Yamamoto's plane when it got shot down, I'm going to follow this one all the way to the ground. What am I talking about? I'm talking about anthropogenic global warming, because I think ultimately the hysteria that's been raised because of it will turn out to be one of the greatest hoaxes in the history of science, showing how politics can seriously distort science. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Leffler here with you. If you remember, we've been treated to a series of angsts. First, we had the post-World War II nuclear scare, the Cold War. I remember growing up during that time. And then we transitioned into the general war scare, Vietnam. And then we got into the environmental scare. Now, this was the one that the one-worlders really liked, because they suddenly realized that this was one threat that faced all of mankind that they could then create supranational solutions to. And, of course, if you covered the 1992 UNCED conference in Rio, you knew that they had dollar signs in their eyes, because they understood that the mechanism would be wealth transfer and taxation. And so all of the money got poured into people who would find a reason why mankind's activities are involved in global warming. That was the political side of it. If you wanted to prove that maybe it didn't exist, you wouldn't get funded. The other side that's always been interesting to me out of the environmental movement has been the idea that we're told we come from nothing, we go to nothing, we're a product of random chance and evolution and a part of nature. But when it comes to talking about environmental issues, suddenly we become something apart. And the message frequently from some of the real hardcore elitists in the environmental movement has been that mankind is bad for the environment, for the planet, and if we could just get rid of mankind, we'd be okay. The planet would be a wonderful place to live, except you wouldn't be living here. This just popped out recently as a part of the whole global warming issue, which just sort of rumbles forward anymore here on the show. And I wanted to talk about that because Dr. Matt Briggs, who's an adjunct professor of statistics at Cornell University, wrote a very good article on it. Global warming alarmists plead, save the children by not having them. I thought, well, this is an interesting one. He was a former meteorologist with the National Weather Service and a professor at the Cornell Medical School. So this is a new study. It's coming out, right? And what are its basic premises, and what is it telling us?
It's out now. The study's out now. The basic premises are that we're already doomed unless we can somehow eliminate people. The world is going to be uninhabitable for people, these philosophers say, not scientists, philosophers, unless we could eliminate people. So they really do say the best way to save your children is by not having them. And I say that, well, if you believe that argument, it's like saying the best way to save your house from fire is by not building it. It makes no sense whatsoever, but you're quite right in your opening segment there. These environmentalists don't like people. They want to see far fewer people than are alive now. They want them eliminated by one way or another. They're quite happy to have them not have more babies, and that's generally the take of this paper. They don't want anybody having children. And they use the words coercion. They think it's not unfair to discuss the idea of the government using coercive force to keep people from having babies. That's the frightening part. Coercion's one part. They're quite willing to use manipulation, lies, outright deceit. These are their words. They're not my words. They're very happy to use false advertising, this kind of sitcom stuff where they show happy families with just one child or none, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but we just tried that in China.
That's right, and it was a brutal policy.
Yeah.
I mean, there were imprisonments, forced sterilizations, forced abortions, penalties, ostracization, everything that you can imagine that happened in China from their one-child policy. And now they're hurting from it. They're going to be soon hurting from it because they sort of killed off a lot of their future by doing this. This particular paper, they're so certain that we're going to be doomed that they really are serious. And they're not the only ones. There's many, many, many of these people who have prominent academics in the highest ranking journals and venues and so forth that have this. A year or two ago, this guy named Lau, not quite certain how it's pronounced, from New York University, he also figured that the problem with the world was people. But he didn't say don't have more people. He said the best way to handle the situation is to have smaller people. So we can still have a lot of people, but if we have smaller people, these smaller people won't burn as many greenhouse gases. And the way to bring about smaller people was, of course, through the obvious, genetic manipulation. So they're going to be very happy to have a lot of in vitro fertilizations and so forth as a way of reproducing our species, where we can monkey and tinker with the genes and produce very tiny people. Perhaps it's not a coincidence that Lau himself is sort of diminutive. Maybe it's more envy on his part than anything else.
I could see an advantage of that. You could fit into airline seats better. That would maybe be...
Oh, boy. Not only that, there's all these things. My gosh, they want to poison the meat supply. I kid you not. This is a prominent journal, a prominent academic is writing. Why poison the red meat supply? Because people enjoy eating red meat too much, and red meat is responsible for greenhouse gases, they say, so that we can keep producing red meat. But if we poison it with certain chemicals to make it distasteful, people will say, you know what, I don't really like this red meat. I'm going to stop eating it. And that'll be a better way than to try to talk people out of eating red meat.
Well, if you go back far enough in some of this literature, I'm talking about probably about 3 decades, you can find ideas that were floated, such as, why don't we put birth control stuff in the water supply? Everybody in cities have to drink the water. We'll just not poison, but taint the water supply, and people will just stop having babies. And then if you go all the way back to Margaret Sanger, remember the idea was sex without reproduction, reproduction without sex, just like you were talking about, in vitro stuff.
That's exactly right. You mentioned that conference John Kerry was at. They started their organization. These people, they really do view mankind as a sickness. The word cancer has been thrown around a lot. Mankind is a cancer on the planet. This guy who's named Schellenhuber, he is an advisor to
Pope Francis.
Pope,
yeah,
if you can believe it.
Yep.
He is an advisor to the British government, to our government. He is on all these fancy panels. He has been awarded a knighthood in England. He's a German quantum physicist who stuck his nose into this. And he has the idea that the Earth itself is alive. It's a living computer-like organism. And he's dead serious about this, and he writes of this, like I say, in the most prominent journals. And so that the Earth itself, since it's an organism, this is a sort of a newfangled scientific pantheism.
Yeah, I was going to say in pantheistic ideas, it's the Gaia principle.
It's the Gaia principle, but in his idea, it's a little bit different because he envisions the world more like a computer than the Gaians take the Earth as alive itself. But they're all the same kind of pantheistic ideas. And he says the Earth suffers from syndromes, sicknesses. He doesn't say cancers. He says instead syndromes. And these syndromes are caused by people. So it's quite clear. And he said, I think maybe I got the figure wrong, but I think it was 1 billion. He said the Earth could not support more than 1 billion people. And of course, we have many more than 1 billion now, and we're doing fine.
Remember, Paul Ehrlich in the 60s was saying similar things. And I think it's important to point out, and you did in your article, that most of these projections about AGW are based on models. And the hysterical levels of numbers that we're supposed to be seeing in temperature rise are not occurring. They're trying to explain away, say, for example, the pause, as they're calling it. I said, how do you know it's not a reversal in a long-term cycle? And the answer is, we don't. But these models always project things, and they're always based on certain presuppositions. I guess I'm straddling the line between science and philosophy here.
As well you should. This is exactly the right point to make. The models are built on the theory that carbon dioxide is this terrible gas. They have to go into the physics and tweak it such that more carbon dioxide dramatically boosts the temperatures. And so we created these models, and they make predictions of future climate. And those predictions are always higher. The temperatures are always higher than we actually realize. And not only that, the discrepancy between these forecasts and what we see in reality is growing wider and wider and wider. Now, it's a philosophical point and a scientific point, too, to say, look, if the forecasts are this bad, something is wrong with them. We should not be believing them. They could not make skillful, accurate predictions. Therefore, the theory is busted. Therefore, carbon dioxide is not nearly as scary as they have been saying. And therefore, we shouldn't trust these models. We shouldn't use them to base decisions on. They're wrong. Why should we? The only answer is because these people don't understand the science at all. They don't understand the science of global warming, and they don't even necessarily believe in global warming. What they believe in is the solution to global warming.
Now, that's what I want to pick up on when we get back from the news break here. Dr. Matt Briggs is my guest right now. He's adjunct professor of statistics at Cornell University and professor at Cornell Medical School previously, statistician at DoubleClick when it was starting out, and a meteorologist with the National Weather Service. And his book coming out this year is The Philosophy of Probability and Statistics. And that's what you're dealing with when you talk about anthropogenic global warming. People will say, science says. In reality, it's philosophy speaking, because these projections are being made upon theoretical, philosophical models based on certain presuppositions, and they're not coming true. Do remember we have a Section 6 intelligence brief for all of our online listeners at steelonsteel.com and a special page praying for persecuted Christians on Facebook. We're at steelonsteel.com. I'm John Leffler, the program